Hello, everyone. Welcome to MD Media's weekly show, the H Panel. The H Panel today will talk about Ethiopia, making sense of its 2023 Fragile States ranking. And I'm happy to be joined today by Faisal Robla, Dr. Bridge, and Itana Hapte. I should welcome Dr. Itana Hapte, as this is his first time to join us at the H Panel. Itana, welcome.
Thank you very much, Getachew.
Great. So we'll start with the highlights of the week. What stood out for each one of you? And Faisal, can you start us off with the highlights of the week for you?
Yes, thank you very much, Getachew. I think I was fascinated by the discussion at the Paris summit, which I looked at, and basically, the question that came to me as I watched and read is the Horn of Africa, and in general, Africa, the cradle of hunger, and why Africa did not develop unlike some of the other global South. So I don't know, David, Getachew, if you want to share the PowerPoint I shared with you, or I can just go and read from my point of.
I will bring them up. You can continue.
So great. So basically, my first slide is just comparing Somalia and Ethiopia in terms of where the statistical numbers of hunger and challenges are. So as you can see, Somalia with 6.5 million people with food security, and Ethiopia almost over 20 million. And with Somalia, 1.8 million children starving and malnutrition subject, and then Ethiopia close to 7.4 million. And as you go deeper and deeper into the numbers, the picture of both Ethiopia and Somalia, and in general, that Horn of Africa region gets bad. Now, that is not only the case for Ethiopia, but also the case for many African countries. So I kept questioning as the Paris Climate Summit went underway and Ethiopia's prime minister attended, representing at least one of the major countries in the global South. I kept wondering, like, why Africa did not develop, unlike, say, some of the global South, such as Korea and others. And it's very interesting to know that in the 1970s, both Ghana and Uganda were with the same GPD per capita as South Korea. Actually, Ghana was a little higher, and China was not that far apart. So what happened? Those are the questions that I've been for the whole week playing with, and I didn't get the right answer, but I will probably come back at the last. And then the next slide is basically, if you remember, thank you very much. The last COP 2022, but COP 27 promised some issues to be addressed in the issue of climate change. And I became skeptical the more I read the whole politics of climate change vis-a-vis Africa and Ethiopia in general, the more I become skeptic as to, do these African countries really using climate change as a way to get some debt relief and other issues, or these are real changes? I don't have the answer, but as a student of development and social change, I'm not sure 100% if the whole climate change is addressed by African leaders and by Ethiopian prime minister as an issue that he has to deal with. So basically, I'm just raising the questions. What are the issues? Why are they now using? This is not the first time we brought some issues to the developed world, and some of us who probably aware of the development studies in the 1970s, McNamara, when he was running the World Bank, income inequality was the big cliche used, and then later on it was women and children. Now it's climate change. So is this a ploy for failed African leaders to just come something to the table in order to negotiate with the West? Next. But there are some real inequity. Next slide. There are some real inequity issues. Yes, in terms of climate change and who produce climate change. This table shows you that Africa in particular, but Ethiopia and Somalia probably put in the lowest carbon dioxide emission to the air, as opposed to the US, Japan, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates, the highest per capita in terms of what they put. And our proximity as a Horn of Africa to the Arab world, who are producing the largest volume of oil, definitely has some environmental issue impact on us and climate change. Are we really having that kind of conversation with United Arab? By the way, Qatar has the highest ratio in terms of per capita of carbon monoxide. United Arab Emirates is next, and then you go up, and US is there. Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, we put into the air the lowest carbon dioxide per in terms of density. Next. So the whole South North conversation is not new. In the 80s, when Ethiopia was subject to that famine, Susan George wrote a very touchy book, How the Other Half Dies. So we were subject to hunger then, and we are subject to hunger today. And definitely climate change plays a significant role. But there is something that we need to really fathom beyond the climate change conversation, especially for the Horn of Africa. So we need to really get to the real issue. What is the cause that's making Africa, and particularly the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia, hungry? And as I said, Getachew last week, anybody who knows Oromia and some parts of Ethiopia should never even think of hunger as an issue, because those lands are really, really God-given fertile land. So there are other issues in addition to environmental and climate change. Next. So basically, as I say, Ghana and Uganda were in the same level in terms of development with South Korea. Today, where South Korea is 30,000 per capita for its citizens, whereas Ghana is stuck with 1,000. Ethiopia is probably now 800, 900. And it looks like we are moving in a snail's pace, whereas some global South countries, Singapore, South Korea, Indonesia, seem to have gotten out of the misery. And what's their secret? Definitely, I argue that the World Bank IMF conversation that we have been hearing from Prime Minister Abiy this week and others is not really the solution. We are still asking World Bank and IMF, who played a significant role in terms of putting Africa where it is, and Ethiopia for that matter, is still being given the power to restructure our lives. Just as a last point, the place where I grew up, Jigjiga, in the 1950s, when Ethiopia was helping in the war of Korea, some of the grain that were shipped to Korea through the USAID were purchased in the grain fields of Jigjiga. This is, what the situation was. And still, Somalis in that area carry the folktales and the songs as to what they have done for the world and for Haile Selassie and for, and that's certainly true for Oromia and other regions. So something beyond climate change is dragging Africa. And I really did not like Prime Minister Abiy's solution to the issue. I kind of felt okay with President Ruto's suggestions of creating a path where everybody pays depending on what they do and what they don't do to the environment. And finally, the Horn of Africa needs to revisit the Bab el-Mandeb and the Gulf of Aden, which handles a huge amount of the gas and oil that's shipped to Europe. 30% of Europe's oil passes in our neighborhood. What is our role? What are we doing? Do we need to do something? And with that, I don't think the right discussion was held at the Paris summit, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Faisal, for that highlight. I want to continue with Itana. So, what were the highlights for you over the past week? Given this is your first time as well, you may share a broader view of the big ticket items for you, Dr. Itana.
Thank you very much, Getachew. I want to make some points based on the developments in parts of Ethiopia that came out on news, but that have not received much attention globally or even continentally. But these issues are reflections or the windows that helps us look into what we are going to talk about, the state fragility. The first thing is about cholera epidemic in parts of Oromia that came out in some news, local news, and some English news. But I haven't seen many media outlets capturing on that or trying to reflect on that. I want to mention about the cholera epidemic because it is a new layer of crisis in the country that have been ravaged by various forms of violence over the past 5 years. The Tigray genocide, different forms of wars in Oromia and various parts of Ethiopia, different parts of Ethiopia, including Benishangul Gumuz and Gambela, and also in the border areas between Afar and Somalia. So this is a new layer. Parts of Somali region and Oromia is now hit by a new wave, but not completely new, but a new layer to existing crisis over the past 5 years. And this, to the people on the ground, is serious problem. It hasn't even got attention from the regime in power. It hasn't got attention from international donors who always try to capture on major issues and try to address some of them. And this problem also has not got attention even on media outlets. But this is one major problem that we can use as a window to look into recent developments that happened in the region. The second is what happened and what is going on in Tigray. I want to mention the issue in Tigray based on the EOC, Ethiopian Orthodox Church Bishop of Adigrat, what he made as a complaint, highlighting the problem of his people in Adigrat. The problem is not limited to Adigrat, but he is a bishop of Adigrat who spoke out about the problem. As every one of you remember, there is a discussion about aid diversion or aid theft related particularly to the Tigray region, and various organizations spoke about that. In relation to that, aid to Tigray region was suspended, and the arrival of aid in Tigray has been a serious issue over the last 2 3 years, as you remember, because of the nature of war and various forms of violence we have experienced in that region. If we travel in time, at least 12 months back, a major concern for Tigray, for most of us who speak in public, is whether or not the people would be able to receive some aid in terms of health and food. When the peace agreement was signed in Pretoria and followed up with another peace agreement in Nairobi, the people got some relief. Now, because of the complexities and structural issues that laid and resulted in aid diversion, whoever was involved, again, grassroots, the most seriously affected people during the war and in time of peace. Now, aid is suspended again. And this, the Archbishop of Adigrat lately spoke about that. And this is another issue that helps us as a window to look into another major layer of challenges, difficulties that people live their daily life in parts of the Horn of Africa. Aid diversion is not a new development in the Horn of Africa and broadly on the continent, but in a region that was affected by a war that has been represented as genocide. This is a serious problem. It's a major problem. And those of us who speak in public want to make sense of what it means for people, what it means to the state, what it means to the region, because the issue in Tigray has been a regional issue. It was a regional war. It was a global conflict in some sense, where major global actors were involved in making the war, as well as the achievement of peace agreements that happened lately in the late 2022. Finally, I want to make a quick comment about the Paris summit that focused on Africa, using what the president of Kenya said during his speech, or the comment he made, particularly pushing back the Western standards that want to define African issues all the time by allowing Africa to be actor at some level and trying to use the little available resources. And when it comes to global structure, Africa remains victim from time to time. So what the president of Kenya, Ruto, said, especially in the face of the French president, is not something to be taken lightly. And I believe the president made his comment with full awareness of what it means in terms of relationship between his country and the continent to the rest of the world, particularly globally powerful institutions that he mentioned, especially the World Bank and the IMF, financial institutions that borrow money to African countries, especially over the last 4 or 5 decades. These institutions borrowed billions of dollars that made African countries, or left most of them in poverty. The proposal was presented in good faith. The money was borrowed, I believe, in good faith, and especially on paper, they look great. But the history of Africa suggests that was a spectacular failure, getting financial aid in order to develop your economy, in order to improve the health conditions of your people. And the comment of Kenya's president, I believe, was made with full awareness, because that comment must be supported by actions, not simply by what you say, because he is at the top of the hierarchy of administration of his country. He has a say on the continent's continental meetings, African Union, IGAD, and he has the opportunity to shape the relationship between at least between his country and the Western world. And I wanted to emphasize on his comment because I can read some good awareness about putting certain African countries on a challenging but the right path to development. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Itana, for that remark. Duke, again, welcome after a long time of break, I would say, and different reasons for the past weeks. So what's the highlight for you?
Well, the highlight for me is the suspension of food aid in Tigray. The 3 months, we're going to be at the 3-month point in about 3 days. This has been, the situation on the ground is deteriorating quickly. There's been starvation reports coming in from all over the region. It's been covered by the major media outlets, mainstream media, that has been less than helpful in some cases in their coverage. They have all been covering the conditions on the ground, and it doesn't seem to translate into urgency on the fact on the from the World Food Program or from USAID, and that's a real problem. The UN knows that there's starvation on the ground. They have sent assessments out to places like Endabagona and in the southeast region, the southeast zone, several of the districts there. They know what's going on. These are just the ones we know of. There are more assessments out there. They've been blocking at least one assessment every month since February. It looks like they're trying to cover up something. This was happening for a very long time when the Ethiopian government was trying to keep a lid on how bad things were getting in Tigray. Now it appears that they're either self-censoring or that the humanitarian actors are self-censoring, or maybe there's still some agreement that they do not publish information about the conditions on the ground. But this is really horrible. This is a horrible practice that they're doing. The latest word that we're getting is that possibly food aid will restart in the second half of July if the World Food Program is able to control the targeting, the distribution, just about everything that has to do with the distribution of aid in Tigray. Now, it's not a terrible practice for humanitarian agencies to have more control over things like targeting, who qualifies for aid, or how that gets to them. But the World Food Program has a very, very spotty track record when it comes to delivering food, particularly to the Northwest Zone, where the World Food Program is the implementing partner, or is at least the program partner there. There's several implementing partners. They haven't done a very good job. And so I wish they had a better partner there. I wish the World Food Program was a more trustworthy, incredible organization right now in Tigray, in Ethiopia more broadly. But in 2021, the country director of the World Food Program was saying that there wasn't any starvation deaths because he had done some informal checking. That was his investigation. Now, hopefully this investigation is a little more sophisticated. Hopefully they will be looking at situations on the ground, conditions on the ground, how it's affecting the people they're supposed to be serving, rather than just what's happened to the food that was stolen. They're talking about food enough to feed more than 100,000 people in Shiraro. If that food didn't get there, if that food didn't get to those people, yes, that's a theft. That should be investigated, that should be punished, prosecuted, whatever. But that should also be investigated is how those 100,000 people in Shiraro are doing right now. They didn't get food since before January. There is occupation from Eritrean troops. It's a shaky security situation. They're still operating, or they were still operating at the time that the diversion was first discovered, or that the theft there from the warehouse was first discovered. So what USAID and the World Food Program are doing is they're focusing a lot of attention on the investigation, which is of course understandable, but they need to be restarting aid in places where it can be restarted. The fact that right now, at almost at the 3-month mark, we're at 0% of places that they feel secure in delivering food to is a real problem. And if there's some sort of power sharing problem with the government of Ethiopia, it's interesting that that's coming up now, and that didn't come up for the past couple of years. If the problem was with the interim government, then those things need to be resolved, but they need to be resolved in a way that happens very quickly. Food should be restarted this week. If food isn't restarted this week, people will die this week. And that's something that should be the worst case scenario for the World Food Program, is that somebody dies in an area that they are supposed to be delivering food. But unfortunately, that does not seem to be the priority. And that's a sad state of affairs, particularly with the fact that Tigray is not the only place in Ethiopia where there's starvation. Of course, there's starvation elsewhere coming from the conflict. There's starvation in related to the drought. There's starvation all over the Horn of Africa, in other places, the Horn of Africa, also related to conflict. And in the case of Sudan, also related to the drought in the case of Somalia. and there's starvation all over the world that the World Food Program is supposed to be addressing, that USAID is supposed to be addressing. The fact that they can't get their crap together in Tigray is a very, very bad sign. It either means that they have dehumanized the people of Tigray that they're supposed to be serving right now, or it means that their system is so screwed up that they cannot be counted on to deliver food aid. And either one of those is a huge problem.
Great. Thank you, Duke, for highlighting that for us. And we will start with the topic of the day, so the Fragile States Index. It came out this week. And given that we are online as well as on HBS, under the Horn Broadcasting Services on Satellite Zone of Africa, will be limited by maximum of 1 hour. So we'll try our best to cover the topic. So this came last week, and as you can see, our viewers, this is a 2023 Fragile States Index, and Ethiopia is on number 11, Somalia being the first. The way this works is around 12 indicators are aggregated, and the higher the number, the worse. That's how it's interpreted. So if you go all the way to number 179, you will find Norway. Norway being the one of the few that are deemed as not only stable but sustainable as well. So Ethiopia is in the first group that are based on this index in the range of alert. So this is 90. If you get a total of FCI score of 90 to 120, which is the maximum, you are in the alert red category. So this is where Ethiopia is 100.4. So Faisal, what is your reading in terms of what you see, what you hear on the ground versus what this Fragile States Index is telling us?
Yeah, I think these numbers are meticulously collected and analyzed without any focus to any nation or country. Just numbers lead wherever your country arrives. I'm not surprised to see Somalia, Yemen, South Sudan at the top of the list. At least in the case of Somalia, we had a totally collapsed state. So is Yemen, and Southern Sudan is coming out. What is very shocking is the Ethiopian case. Until recently, as we know, Ethiopia was growing with a double-digit rate. The country was more or less, I think the only category that was dismal, if you will, was the human rights during the EPRDF. That was probably an area that somebody could say, if EPRDF era that was approved, most of the other issues, the economy is doing good, the safety of the country was good. You could move from Addis Ababa anywhere in the country that you wanted. All those issues and indices that we are looking at have been literally turned upside down. So there is no way Ethiopia and Prime Minister Abiy's government can escape from this analysis to be at the bottom of the list and be equated to countries like Somalia and Yemen, where the country has collapsed. So I think if Prime Minister Abiy's government has any sense of urgency, this should be, this and the other issues that both my colleagues mentioned should advise him to go to the drawing board and probably do some change if that's even possible. But this number strike me as reflective of the conditions in which Ethiopia is today.
Thank you, Faisal. Itana, again, the same. What did you feel when you go through this report, given what you are writing in the first segment from Oromia to overall performance and what you see to Tigray, everything and so on. So given these 12 indicators, they have multiple of sub-indicators under them. And like Faisal was mentioning, there were a number of methodologies used to triangulate whatever the numbers are saying. Itana.
Thank you. in many ways. I mean, the status Ethiopia has been provided on this ranking is not surprising, given the situation the country was put in 2018 since the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed and his colleagues, whatever the name they got, the party or the ideology they got in leading the country. So I think by now there isn't anyone who can dispute the failure of the path to transition Ethiopia was put on in 2018. And what led Ethiopia to find itself at this level has been observed already over the last 5 years. And we don't want to, give our viewers what they already know. But I tried to take time looking through the methodology this website or the company used, and it's substantive, sound method. And the ideas and the criteria used are important, impressive ones, particularly the 4 broader categories that you are displaying on the screen. The issue of cohesion, political issues, economic issues, and social issues are very, very important in determining where Ethiopia is. But I reserve this comment for later when I come back, because despite the strength of this ranking, I can also read some weaknesses, especially with regard to Ethiopia. And I will take some examples from this ranking and what happened over the last 5 years in order to show what I mean. But broadly speaking, this is almost a perfect description and representation of where Ethiopia is. It is a serious concern. It's a concern for the Horn of Africa. It must be a concern for the continent. It must be a concern for global community. And when we discuss about the ranking of Ethiopia, it's not just about Ethiopia. It's about the Horn of Africa. It's about global community. Because the peace and war, the success and failure of huge states like Ethiopia could significantly affect not just the Horn of Africa, but the continent itself and the Red Sea Basin and the Middle East region. And we have seen part of these problems when the Tigray war was actively fought, or Tigray genocide, to represent it much better. So it's a serious concern. Who is at the top of this making? Who made Ethiopia to slide back, perhaps by decades, to this status? Is the assumption, the assumption, the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed and his colleagues. And there are lots and lots of evidences to represent that. But when I come back later, I want to look a little deeper into the ranking and take some examples to highlight some weaknesses that will help us look at the case of Ethiopia closely.
Mm-hmm. Great, that would be great, Itana. Duke, I know you have closely looked at some numbers and comparisons and so on. So, what is your? You can take out there.
Yeah. The fragility rating for Ethiopia was based a lot on the demographic pressures that came in very high. Human rights, refugees, IDPs, the security apparatus, external interventions. These are all related to conflict. Even the IDPs, when you think about the drought and everything, that's only a small portion of the IDP population in Ethiopia right now. The majority are displaced by conflict. That's not just in Tigray, that's actually also in Oromia, also in Somali region. According to the latest records from the IOM, most of the displacement is happening because of conflict. And one thing that these sort of miss, and I remember when the fragile states, the concept was sort of being floated around when it came out, and it was a big deal, but I think that they were missing some things. One thing that I think they were missing is that if you have a military that spends most of its time shooting at your own citizens, you're going to be fragile. It's going to be unstable. These are the things that can't be quantified as well. But if you look at what happened in the past 4 years, you look at the difference between Ethiopia and Kenya in 2019, Ethiopia and Kenya were neck to neck. They were both in an elevated risk, but not nearly as bad as Ethiopia is now. Now, Kenya fell, in a positive way, fell on that list. They're doing much better. Ethiopia is doing slightly worse. It seems very obvious what the issues are in Ethiopia. Even the demographic pressures, some people will read that as like a youth bulge. Now, that's sort of a reductive theory about conflict, is when there's a certain amount of youth, then you leave. But they're not looking, if you look at the methodology, demographic pressures do not just focus on the amount of youth, or, it's about how you're able to provide for the population, food security, water security, access to water, access to food, access to education, access to these things. Those are factored into the domestic pressures. Human rights, it should have been a lot better in Ethiopia now. That was one of the promises that we got from Abiy. We don't have enough jails to put everybody in jail, so we're going to start on a fresh page. He was letting a lot of people. I actually got to spoke to a lot of people who got let out of prison when Abiy came into power. These have been rolled back considerably due to war, and this is the impulse of the Prosperity Party to slug it out with whoever is putting up opposition, political opposition, or otherwise. This is the dividend. This is what happens after that. If you stop the people of Tigray from planting their fields, if you can't get the Eritreans out so that the people of Tigray can plant their fields, if you can't get the agricultural supplies in, you're going to have food insecurity. You're going to have a deep level of food insecurity. There could have been enough food there to feed a lot of people in Ethiopia, not just in Tigray. But war trumps everything. War is if your country's at war, that's going to be more important than a lot of other things. But if the country is always at war with itself, then it's going to completely stop good things from happening, positive developments from happening. It's going to contribute to insecurity. And so when you look at what's happened compared to Kenya and Ethiopia is doing a lot worse. Kenya is doing a lot better. There should be this idea that Ethiopia is starting to sort of broadcast this idea that Ethiopia is sort of the center of the universe as far as policymaking and Pan-Africanism and all of these anti-imperialism or whatever though. But they should be looking at Kenya and seeing what's happening in Kenya, what people are doing right in Kenya. Kenya is not without problems. The human rights indicator for Kenya surprises me that it's that low, but of course my previous experience was in counterterrorism, and that was where there was a serious problem with human rights. But these things are not impossible. They are impossible if most of the government, most of the budget, most of the efforts are bent towards destroying one part of your country, one part of the of Tigray or Oromia, or even before that when they were selecting different religious backgrounds to persecute. These things cost money. They cost development. They cost the future. It's when everybody was saying he's mortgaging his future to destroy Tigray. I mean, that wasn't a joke. That seems to be what's happening. And of course, it's not just Tigray. It's other places as well. But it looks like it's a bad state. Just real quick though, interestingly enough, the economy, although it's not doing well, the economy was not one of the major drivers of instability that they found on the list. Now that's interesting because that's where you see a lot of activity happening to boost the economy of Ethiopia, which of course, we want to see a healthy economy in Ethiopia, but to do that at the expense of getting IDPs back to their homes, to do that at the expense of human rights, of enforcing universal standards of human rights, that can contribute to the factors that you're already seeing, the drivers that are already seeing. When the places like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank show that you can still get money from them while treating your people very terribly, that can exasperate the drivers of instability and fragility. And I think that's what we're seeing there.
Yeah, I can admit now. Okay, thank you so much, Doc, for that. I think that will give us the time to deepen into some of the factors. Faisal, one of the things that they looked at, maybe need to highlight, is the fractionalized elites index. So, as part of this bigger index, the fragile state index, they talk about group grievance index and a number of them. But can you speak to that, given that you have been writing for so many years about elite and especially the political um, elite of Ethiopia? So, what did you read there in terms of how this index is ranking Ethiopia on that specific aspect?
Yeah, I think first of all, we need to really underscore the fact that this particular approach to fragility is done by one entity. It may or may not represent everybody's research or viewpoint. So we just evaluate it and take it for whatever it is for that particular institution that's making. In terms of the functionality within the elite and how that factors in, at least I've been following Ethiopia's elite around the issue of political rearrangement, which came as a result of EPRDF taking power and for the first time addressing the burning issue of Ethiopia, which is the national issue, the national question, which in the past the elite more or less were united around in terms of how to define, which came from the 1960s and 70s student movement. They had some variations, but if you take Meoson, if you take EPRP, TPLF, even Western Somali Liberation Front, OLF, they were more or less allies. I think the big division of the elite came around the issue of federalism and the rights of nations and nationalities. That has divided. Now, 1991 all the way to, I would say, 2015, 2018, they were divided, but the alignment of the groups were different. I used to write for the Ethiopian Review, and the very groups that sided with Dr. Abiy after the Oromia alliance put Abiy there, raided on Tigray elites at least, and I would reserve the comment of saying Tigray in general, although that was the case, because some people were openly saying, put Tigray or Tigrawa in concentration camps or what have you. So the elites were always divided. To those of us who are insiders, they were always divided. It was to the outsiders, people like Donald Levine, who used to articulate a point of view that catered to the mythical Ethiopia, that said that there is this urban class of Ethiopia that is raceless, nationalityless, ethnicless, which was not true. I think when I used to regularly write for the Ethiopian Review, the same division that you see today was there, except that the focus and the animosity was on two groups, Eritrea and Tigray or TPLF. With the current division, some shifting of powers took place, and Eritrea became the friends of the group that were initially opposing the government, and they gravitated toward supporting the Abiy government. So the division level was actually worse at this point in time, because some people who had morals in the past came outright and really defended what we call genocide in some, and I have in mind the leftover of the EPRP, who hitherto were some sort of progressive revolutionary, at least they shied away from some issues. But this time, people like Indar Gaicho, who claimed to have been leadership of the EPRP, were out there to really support ethnic cleansing and genocide. So the division is this time were acute, but they were more glaring to the outsiders. To the insiders, for me, it was just a rearrangement of who is where and who moved from what camp to the new camp. But the elite division is very real. And I think if anybody's breaking this country into different groups, it would be the elite's entrenched ideology that is, wants to paint Ethiopia one or the other.
Thank you, Faisal. Itana, you want to take us into some details in terms of weaknesses and some indicators, I guess.
Right. Like I said earlier, the ranking attached to Ethiopia is very real, and I don't think anyone can dispute that. And it's good to have this kind of report at this critical juncture. When you look at the top of the indicators of this fragile states index, I think it is a product of the Fund for Peace. You see a broader categorization they use, which is called Conflict Assessment Framework, or CAST, which means the work broadly takes into account issues of conflict, which is not bad, because conflicts indicate and translate to various factors that shape a society. But when you don't have conflict, you may have structural issues that lead into conflict or even wars in certain societies. Let me give you one example. During EPRDF Ethiopia, the news outlet, the information you have about Ethiopia are multiple, but the dominant one is about performance, Ethiopia's good performance in economy. That is what you hear from IMF. That is what you hear from World Bank. That is what you hear from some major media outlets, that Ethiopia is doing well in terms of economy. But towards the end of the news you read or you hear or you watch, you see a very small but violations of human rights. That small but was a very big but no one wants us to read that very small but at a big but at that time. EPRDF Ethiopia was performing very well economically, at least compared to the past and the time Ethiopia is in right now. So I think that is undisputable. There was a very good economic performance. But that was not all about Ethiopia. Ethiopia was in a serious structural difficulty when it was performing economically. There was serious structural issues, defining issues, showing some signs, but not everyone is willing to read those signs. Signs that would blow up later, but no one will be willing to read it, because the philosophy of the time was that economic success would override divisions. Economic success would override and resolve problems caused by poverty and health challenges, even political divisions. Those problems, those small buts that I said earlier about human rights, issues that have been presented as human rights violation became a major issue few years later. Look at what happened in the Somali region in the late 2000s under APRDF. It was a major crisis, but it was reported as small but. Look at what happened in parts of Oromia. It was reported as small but because many organizations, many media outlets, global institutions believed that Ethiopia was on the right path to success, development, economic performance. But when you see the rapture of protesters in Oromia first, spreading later into Amara region, every weakness was exposed, revealed. From that point of view, when you read back some analysis, you can say most issues have been ignored. I raise this not to talk about the past, but to highlight some weaknesses about the current report that we have about Ethiopia. The weaknesses we have about Ethiopia is not very much related to who does the report or what even the report says. It's about, the ability to read deeper social codes in the country. It's about the ability to read and accurately represent the path the country have been taking over the last 5-6 decades. All right. So if you say conflict was not explicit in Ethiopia before 2018, at least after the end of the Ethio-Eritrean War, it was not explicit. So under this criteria, you cannot see major problems under the rankings of this fragility state, fragile state index. I'm not saying this simply because it comes under the categorization of conflict assessment framework. A good example is 2019, how Ethiopia was represented in 2019. You remember where Ethiopia was in global narrative and at the global stage in 2019. There was huge euphoria. Everybody hoped success is at the door. No one, maybe very few, thought that Ethiopia would slide back. We all wished success to the country when EPRDF was gone. It was on the basis of that euphoria that some analysis have been done. And that is very much represented in what happened in 2019, awarding a warmonger leader as a Nobel Peace Prize. That is how deep the country has been misrepresented when you look at the issues very, very closely. So the way Ethiopia was represented in 2019 on the Fragile State Index was similar, because there was a leader who talked about peace, but preparing for war, visibly. There was, a state conversation, a state-level conversation about peace, about dialogue, about democracy. But deep down, the preparation was for conflict. In Oromia, the preparation was for conflict. It was not about peace. In Tigray, the preparation, the relationship between the center and Tigray was preparation about war. Benishangul Gumuz, the same. Even in Somali region, very similar. It blew up to the level of full-scale war, to the extent that global community would be concerned deeply, including issues of genocide, only in Tigray. But it happened everywhere, in many parts of Ethiopia.
Ethan, I'm afraid we have to wrap up because we have a limited time on satellite, but it's very interesting point. So can you wrap up? And
Yeah. So the point is two. Just one, the conclusion is very good, excellent, but there are weaknesses that are unable to capture Ethiopia's case when looked closely.
Great, thank you. As you mentioned, 2019, it's everywhere. It's the lowest in terms of ranking, all that, and so on. So we'll go to the Duke. You can comment on any indicator of interest, but at the same time, go with your final remark for the day as well, if you can, in a minute or two.
Okay. Yeah, I want to start by agree with a lot of what was just said. Yeah, in 2019, everybody was high on Ethiopia. Everybody was, and Abiy Ahmed. I mean, that was the thing. He was the new. He was going to wipe away all the problems. He was going to bring in, and he was a great negotiator, and he was a great, he was bringing people together. I remember everybody was all excited about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, coming together with the diaspora. He was going to do the same with the Muslim Council, the Majlis. That didn't happen so well, but yeah, everybody was excited, and they were ignoring what was happening in Oromia. When I was there, they were looking at it as they're trying to sabotage this great moment for Ethiopia, instead of saying, are we too excited about promises that are being made, that were made at every regime change in Ethiopia, the major ones, it was full of promise, and were they going to come true? And people were excited about this. They were ignoring a lot of things, and if they hadn't ignored those things, then a lot of these indicators that you see that are way too high, are very alarming, would not be that high. If there was a little bit more sobriety when it came to looking at countries like Ethiopia, countries in Africa, countries in the global south, or in countries that have gotten themselves into trouble, that are trying to pull themselves out of it, if there was a little bit more sobriety, instead of this blind faith, this prosperity diplomacy almost, that we're just, if we believe in him enough, he'll come through, then the US or the international community, the West, wherever, can be a better partner, can be a more constructive partner for the people of that country, rather than the regime that's going to change, and the next regime might not be as friendly. My final comment about what's going on is that the suspension of aid has to end. It's killing people today. It's got to end. Whatever they do, it has to end. They're killing people right now. The World Food Program, USAID, I understand they need to get to the bottom of it, but they need to turn aid back on, food aid for people who need it. That's my final word. Thank you.
Thank you, Duke, for that. Faisal, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think we are in a sort of critical situation where we advocate rightly for food aid to continue, but at the same time, the very ones that are managing the food aid, corrupting it. As all of us said, it's not a new thing. It's not only the Tigray situation, but food aid becomes a magnet for corruption, for bureaucrats. So how we gonna balance those two is really a challenge. Secondly, I think my second issue would be that the formula so far sought to address Africa's development challenge through IMF and World Bank is just an old book circulated. It will not take Africa out of the situation in which it is. I think Africa needs to find the formula for how to get out, and how some global South countries became developed and out of the poverty, such as South Korea. In the case of Ethiopia, I was one of those early, wrongly, if you can say, critical of Abiy as far back as 2018 July, an interview that I gave to the BBC, because his words to me appear to be very polemic and bereft of policy making and rhetorical. And I wrote several articles as far back as 2018-19. And I was relying, as what Etna said, the structural issue of Ethiopia. You can never get out of the current situation that we are in Ethiopia unless you address the structural issue, the day-to-day famine and human rights, all those change in terms of the scale as we discussed it today. But we need to go back and see how we can change Ethiopia's structural issues and then probably correct the course of action that we like to see. Thank you and welcome to this forum.
Great, thank you. And Etana, the final word is yours today.
Thank you. Just 2 points. One, when we are grateful and be appreciative of what comes out about the Horn of Africa and Africa broadly, we need to get to the bottom of things all the time and make some reflections that make sense and represents what actually happens and is about to happen. Because like the president of Kenya said, the global structure we have, the media outlets we have at global level cannot capture what happens on the continent most of the time. And we need to go a little beyond. For example, the news outlet cannot present full data about what has been going on in Ethiopia over the last 5 years. And if you want to make a serious analysis about Ethiopia, you cannot get everything on internet and available on media. So you need a deeper understanding, a little deeper understanding. Two, we need to pay closer attention, one, to what is going on in Tigray, about the aid, about suspension and possibility of regression. Two, the issue in Oromia, including the prevalence of cholera and conflict. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tana. And that brings us to the conclusion of today's episode of the H panel. And I hope Itana will come back again and join the panelists here. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Duke and Itana for today. And we have been online live and we'll be broadcasting this under HBS to the Horn of Africa as well. And good night from here.
Thank you, Getachew.
Good night. Thank you to all.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.